We're going to submerge you in the dark here because we're going to be showing a clip. I'm sorry to do that to you, but I have several clips from Birth of a Nation. The presentation today will examine D.W. Griffith's stereotypical portrayal of African Americans in his 1915 epic, Birth of a Nation. I'll explore the film's representations from a historical perspective while borrowing from both Georg Simmel's theories on the stranger as well as Maurice Halbwach's philosophies on collective memory. I should mention that I will not be discussing the ways in which Griffith portrays some African Americans through black actors and others through white actors in blackface. This certainly presents a rich amount of material, too much in fact, and so is the subject for another or longer presentation. I would suggest to anyone who's interested in the subject to read Michael Rogan's essay, "The Sword Became a Flashing Vision," in which the topic is discussed. As you'll see the clips, you'll see there are some African-American actors and some white actors in blackface, and it's, as I said, just too much to tackle. So I'm just going to focus on the African-American as a stranger for the purposes of of this seminar here. In addition, this depiction of the African American as stranger will also be used to examine the time in which the film was made, 1914, 1915, and its message analyzed as a critical signal to its contemporary audiences at the time. In Griffith's postbellum world, post-Civil War world, Reconstruction and its most dangerous outcome, namely the freedom of the formerly enslaved African American stranger, had threatened the antebellum order of the Old South. This allowed Griffith to glorify the manner in which the Ku Klux Klan returned the strangers to their rightful place in the social group by the 1890s, restoring the hierarchy that would most allow civilization to thrive. In 1914, Griffith got a hold of the 1905 Thomas Dixon novel, The Klansman, a paradigmatic example of the revisionist history that was being written by Southern authors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the 50th anniversary of the Civil War approached, figures like Dixon retreated from truth in an effort to permeate the white public consciousness with romantic notions of reunification between North and South, the martyrdom of the South, and other revised realities, as he depicted them, of late 19th century America. According to Dixon and later Griffith, the country's disarray during Reconstruction was due to the North's failure to recognize that the reversion of free blacks towards savagery was dividing the nation and plunging it further toward barbarism. Accordingly, Dixon and white supremacists promoted the notion that Southern Anglo-Saxon men had mustered their will to dominance and had redeemed themselves from Reconstruction, namely through the Ku Klux Klan. In this sense, Dixon and Griffith helped to reify a new American imagination that had been developing for several decades, asserting that while the Civil War may have been a lost cause only due to the North's superior industrial might, a vindicated South had won the Reconstruction by reestablishing white male dominance and thus solidifying a reunified nation. A communal self-understanding was born out of this and was perpetrated on the American public, specifically the white American public, as propaganda, most significantly between 1890 and 1917. Anchored on this lost cause philosophy and a romantic depiction of the Old South, the revised history created a new collective memory, teaching Americans in the early 20th century about idyllic antebellum plantation life and about the racial utopia that existed there. Indeed, throughout the first half of Birth of a Nation, these historically flawed theories are seared onto the celluloid. Images abound of the quaint chivalry and pastoral scenery of the Old South, and America, Griffith asserts, that is to be no more. In antebellum America, Griffith presents the African American status as fixed within the social hierarchy. The result of this understanding is a peaceful, idealized society for both African American strangers and their hosts, the white Americans. This confirms Simmel's notion that a group group's uniform life is dependent on specific conditions, including the stranger's various positions as organic members of the group. In the cotton fields around the Camerons plantation, in this scene here, only accessible via the hopelessly romantic Love Valley, as you saw, cordial and content African Americans diligently ply their trade, pleasantly tipping their caps as the Camerons and their guests walk through. So after the demise of the South in the Civil War, depicted famously through Griffith's stirring battle scenes, Griffith uses the second half of the film to depict a persecuted South that was victimized by African American rule and Northern carpetbaggers. According to the film, then, the Civil War and Reconstruction disturbed the fixed status between host and stranger, resulting in a disruption in the uniform antebellum relationship between African Americans and white Americans. The war also divided white America as well, creating an ideological schism that fractured the unified commonality of white men, and thus a battle for superiority took place as the hierarchy was disturbed. And Griffith suggests that these strangers were the ones who sought to take advantage of this lack of social order. It is in this section, the second half of the film, that Griffith most glaringly promoted white supremacy as the savior of civilization. In his portrayals of African American and white characters, Griffith fed white racist fears of black equality and white America's collective imagination by presenting formulaic representations of both sides of the bifurcated color line. In suggesting the destruction wrought by Reconstruction, Griffith stereotyped both blacks and whites in order to visually preserve what white supremacist literature had been touting since 1890, and it basically can be summed up as follows. The freed blacks' descent into savagery in the late 1800s was corrected by civilized white men who restored order and gave birth, as the title implies, to a redefined nation. So what is to follow here, I will demonstrate Griffith's various African American characters and how they conformed to the blueprinted roles maintained by the period's racially charged white supremacist ideology. By magnifying the savagery, the deceit, and the strangeness of African Americans, Griffith was able to contrast them with the restrained strength and civilized organization of the nation's reunified white hosts. Historian David Blight argues that this philosophy developed because, quote, the bulk of white Southerners could not abide by the presence of assertive blacks wearing uniforms and carrying guns, organizing union leagues, and voting and serving on the legislature and on the judicial bench. It's almost as if he is quoting the film. Blight touches upon much of the early part of the Reconstruction section of Griffith's film. Viewers witness the secrecy of a Union League meeting. Black leaders stir crowds in enrolling the African American vote. Then on election day, all blacks are given the vote. And if you look closely, this one in the front here furtively places 2 votes. After he places his initial, he looks around and places a second. While whites are disfranchised and chased from the polling table by armed black guards. The result, of course, is an overwhelming African American majority in the South Carolina legislature, depicted by Griffith as historical fact in the midst of his loose interpretation. When Griffith shows the State House, it is run by unruly blacks, sipping from flasks, eating fried chicken, and putting bare feet on their desks. These caricatures link back to Griffith's pre-war depiction of what scholar Donald Bogle defines as the coon archetype, the unreliable, crazy, lazy, subhuman creatures, good for nothing more than eating watermelon. In the idyllic plantation portion of Birth of a Nation, these characters dance in the streets, providing harmless entertainment for their Southern masters through pleasant and diverting antics, all of which indicates their satisfaction with the system and their role within it as the stranger. But when these figures are in control of the legislature, their buffoonery takes on a more dangerous tone as resolutions pass legalizing interracial marriage and forcing all whites to, quote, salute Negro soldiers on the street. As the character Ben Cameron, the hero of the film, the white hero of the film, recounts various offenses that threaten the traditional Southern way of life, he continues to include what historian Blight contends were other hallmarks of the Southern memories of Reconstruction. These include all black juries, black lawyers, and African American judges acquitting black men as well as abusive black soldiers threatening Southern whites. In fact, the majority of Griffith's Reconstruction blacks are dressed in uniform. And this is a constant visual reminder that former white dominance had been inverted, whereas pre-emancipation black males, whether free or slave, were forbidden to exercise their rights, forbidden to vote, hold electoral office, serve on juries, or join the military. Griffith presented all of these as new realities of Reconstruction, thereby reordering the power structure by ticking off each transgression. Thus, by embodying the perverted system in the consistent appearance of the black soldier in a dark uniform, Griffith would eventually reinstate white dominance through heroic white soldiers dressed in white hoods and white cloaks. Of course, the most offensive of the stock black characters was the sexually starved black rapist, a nightmare set free in Griffith's and white supremacists' imagined world to prey upon delicate Southern white women, such as the young Flora Cameron here. Between 1890 and 1915, psychological historian Joel Williamson asserts that the black rapist was the most significant portrait of racist ugliness used to elicit fears among whites. He was savagery realized, the discouraging end result of emancipation, which showed regression from civilized, white-controlled society to the barbarism that would theoretically result from black freedom. Savage men, according to the trope, lacked the restraint of civilized manners and were guided purely by emotion, raping women as creatures of whim. And much has been written about the presence of this character in the form of Gus, who is seen here pursuing Flora, until she leaps to her death, which is a fate better than rape by the black savage. Her suicide spawns the little Colonel Ben Cameron, the central character in the film, to exact revenge with his white clan as they hunt down, capture, and kill Gus for even thinking of raping a Southern woman. But beyond this archetypal black rapist, Griffith elicited fears in his viewers by simply suggesting this possibility of interracial relations in several other sequences, depicting most blacks as leering aggressors who will take advantage of their newfound equality to act upon their supposed natural desire for white women. When the South Carolina legislature passes the bill allowing black interracial marriage, Griffith shows this group of black lawmakers looking suggestively at the helpless white women in the gallery. Later, when the villainous biracial South Carolina Lieutenant Governor Silas Lynch, seen here, meets Elsie Stoneman, Griffith takes significant measures to depict him ogling her at length. And you could see her innocence is even amplified. Significantly, when Lynch eventually traps Elsie, his first attempt is not to rape her, but forcibly marry her. In both of these cases, then, interracial marriage is presented as the logical offshoot of the black rapist's craving for white women, and one of the ways the stranger would seek to invade and contaminate its white hosts. And even Gus, the character we saw before, pursuing Flora, he even asks Flora to marry him when he catches her, only to hunt her sexually when she refuses. These situations suggest the attempts by freed African Americans to legitimize their union with white women before satisfying their more base desires. Michael Rogan quotes Thomas Dixon as saying that interracial relations between black men and white women would, quote, destroy the foundation of racial life and of civilization. Upset about what I'm saying, I don't blame him. Griffith continually reminded audiences of this threat through his portrayal, this threat of interracial relations through his portrayal of the film's only two biracial mulatto characters, as he calls them, Silas Lynch, seen on the right, and Austin Stoneman's maid Lydia, seen on the left. Both are coded as unstable through their volatile behavior, which is designed to further disrupt the former white dominance through greed and wickedness. Lynch is the film's ultimate villain, this character here, while Lydia is consistently scheming with Lynch to promote the black agenda. And again, these are two biracial characters. This is very significant that they are the ones scheming to promote interracial relations. In this sense, Griffith's depiction of the wickedness that results from a black-white consummation goes against what Donald Bogle terms the classic tragic mulatto character that was present in the early silent film era. While Bogle describes these characters as movie makers' darlings, almost what you see here originally with Lynch's introduction. These are likable, sympathetic characters due to their valiant efforts to pass for white. But Griffith infuses the archetype with deceit, as both mulatto characters furtively work to further black domination. Even Austin Stoneman, the central character, political character, portrayed throughout as a white madman who seeks full equality for blacks. He originally supports Silas Lynch's desire to marry a white woman, as seen in this scene. But it's very significant that when Lynch reveals the white woman he wishes to marry is Stoneman's daughter, Elsie, Stoneman recoils in horror, and Lynch has to trap him and attempt a forced marriage. This abhorrent proposal disconnects Stoneman from his task of racial equality and unites him with the white race. Political rights seem to be one thing, but Stoneman's reaction confirms Griffith's interpretation of the myth. White women were to be shielded from black men, or even more so, shielded from those who were the tainted offspring of such a union between black and white. Nevertheless, Griffith did reserve viewer sympathy for black characters, especially those who understood the hierarchy that would lead to enlightenment and utopia. For whites trying to restore order in Griffith's imagined world, there were those who helped the cause. The faithful slave was a critical aspect of white supremacist thinking in the early 20th century. This model became popular in the literature of Thomas Nelson Page, who created an archetype that reminisced about the finer days of slavery, before freedom left African Americans lonely, bewildered, ruined souls. Indeed, the Camerons, and thus by default all whites seeking justice, have both versions of the faithful slave supporting their cause, the Mammy and the faithful Tom. We can see in this scene that the Mammy is aligned with whites, as she is harassed by the Stoneman's northern black servant, whose bizarre behavior suggests the problems that come with black freedom. Very unusual. Along with the paternal and benevolent Cameron patriarch, who is seen here under arrest, the Mammy and the faithful slave form a cohesive Old South triumvirate that is victimized during Reconstruction by black soldiers. In the end, both of these characters sympathetically portray the African American helping the whites infiltrate the black flanks and thereby heroically protecting the master who has provided so much for them. Here they rescue Cameron, the patriarch, from his imprisonment. Of course, an aging patriarch and two loyal slaves can only do so much and are generally presented as vulnerable to any attack from Griffith's aggressive black hordes. And by the end of the film, Silas Lynch has become the black rapist himself, lurching about and trapping Elsie Stoneman, and the Camerons are holed up in a cabin outside of town, fighting off attacks from unruly black soldiers. And after 2+ hours of setup, Griffith finally unveils his white knights in a familiar early 20th century formula. By constructing black men as natural rapists and by resolutely and bravely avenging the alleged rape of pure womanhood, Southern white men depict themselves as the ideal men, patriarchs, avengers, and righteous protectors. Indeed, Griffith restores white men to the top of the social hierarchy through their faceless clan, clad in sheets and hoods, an army of heroic whiteness, furiously galloping across the countryside and resolutely amassing. And they are the visual and figurative mirrored doubles of Griffith's black transgressors. While the masculine savages run on emotion and lack restraint, civilized white men rise up and reestablish order as the manly, not masculine, but manly embodiment of human perfection, combining masculine physical force with the proper nobility, independence, and honorable will that results in Victorian manhood. This contrast is embodied in the ways that these white characters exhibit a civilized brand of sexual and physical restraint throughout their sections of the film. As they court women, they are coded as peacefully asexual, demonstrating worthy attributes such as chivalry and romance, never allowing any physical urges to control them. This is Ben Cameron on the left, the central character who forms the Ku Klux Klan. In stark contrast to the black rapists, the Southern white men in Griffith's world respect the institution of marriage by controlling their lust in premarital courtship, thereby demonstrating strength in opposition to the passionate, uncontrolled masculinity of the black characters. In addition, Griffith's Klansmen are even the epitome of manly self-control. Griffith famously censored the scene in which Gus is captured. In the original version, Gus was castrated on film, and Griffith cut that. And the result ends up, he ends up indirectly taking out all direct images of brutality, leading to a less maniacal, more controlled version of the Ku Klux Klan. Later, when the Klan rescues Elsie from Lynch's attempt at forced marriage, two hooded heroes hold Lynch down, seen on the left here, but refrain from harming him, holding their fists cocked in threatening and yet controlled anger. Continuing the theme, Griffith even juxtaposes their methods of attack. As the black armies surround and wildly engage, the Klan rides in steady formation, once again suggesting civilized control. And thus Griffith succeeds in creating a warped version of Reconstruction, in which blacks and whites clashed in a contest between controlled, manly white civilization and unmanly, savage black masculinity. This allows him to reconstruct white male dominance through racial dominance, connecting manhood and white superiority. North and South are united, and civilization is eventually saved in a utopian finale, signified by the idyllic partnership of Northern woman Elsie Stoneman and Southern man Ben Cameron. Intercut with their romantic reunion on the shores of a safe America is a dreamlike image of Christ looking over a white celebration. Recalling the antebellum millennial vision directed, quote unquote, directed by the hidden hand of God, the divine providence that showed a perfected racial evolution in which white men protected delicate white women in the advancement of civilization. In this sense, Birth of a Nation was a perfect reminder for 1915 audiences who were witnessing daily progressive era revolutionary efforts by other subjugated groups, new strangers, who were once again threatening the restored racial and gendered order. Women desired an escape from the rigid confines of the private home and a greater social role within the newly developing public space. Immigrants were coming to America to partake of its manufacturing promise. The working class was seeking strength in numbers, uniting against the tyrannical ownership. African Americans and Native Americans continued to push for greater equality as citizens. Historian Stephen J. Diner writes, quote, "People competed continually and sometimes violently to gain advantage or maintain the status quo as institutions changed." With Birth of a Nation, then, Griffith linked 20th century urbanization, women's suffrage, workers' strikes, civil rights, and ethnic infusion to a fabricated collective memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction. These new strangers were reminded that as it was before, so it shall be again. As you attempt to break from your assigned positions within the American social group, the host white heroes will again emerge to guide the human race to the light of advanced civilization. In this sense, D.W. Griffith's visual masterpiece of propaganda would be the opening ideological salvo in a real-world battle to again restore the white male to his position of authority. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to Richard for inviting me. This is my first year as a professor here at Boston College, and although I'm on maternity leave this semester, so I'm really glad to be able to participate in these types of activities that allow me to engage other members of BC's community. So thank you so much. I do ask for your patience as my comments are a little bit informal, so hopefully you'll be able to follow the thread of where it is that I'm trying to go in terms of responding to Michael's wonderful presentation. So if there were to be a title for my comments today, it would be Still Strange Fruit, Images of Black Women in the Media. Why Still Strange Fruit? How many people have heard the song Strange Fruit? It's a Billie Holiday song, and it's about lynching in the U.S., in the South. And the song starts out and she says, "Southern trees bear a strange fruit." And she's referring to the image of, the literal image of African Americans hanging from the trees in the South. And so this image of strange fruit is one that has been referenced often in African American literature and culture and music. And so when you hear strange fruit, it's the literal body that's being referred to, the literal black body that is being lynched, that's being referred to. And I was thinking about this in relation to Black women and this idea of strangeness and the idea of despite some of the progress that has been made in relation to these images, despite some of the progress that has been made and a lot of the backlash that films like Birth of a Nation received, that today in a contemporary context, in some ways, Black women really are still strange fruit. Because when you look at images of Black women in the media and images of Black women in popular culture, there are a lot of strange things that are happening. So I just wanted to play off that idea of strangeness a little bit. And because of my area of specialization, my tendency is really to view things through a feminist prism and to think of things in terms of gender in general. So my comments on my responses to Michael's presentation really centers on this idea of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality suggests that modes of oppression based on gender, religion, race, sexual orientation, class, disability, and the like do not function independently of each other, but that they must be understood and dismantled together. So when I refer to intersectionality, I'm talking about the idea that racism is not separate from sexism, right? So how many images, do people remember any of the images of Black women that from any of the clips that we just saw? Can you remember, can you share with us which the one?
The Mammy image, it comes out strongly, even in the trial case, she's siding with the white
Exactly. The image of Mammy is one of the classic racialized gender stereotypes of black women that we've seen over and over and over throughout the years. In fact, one of the first African Americans to receive an Oscar, not Halle Berry, not Denzel Washington, but was Hattie McDaniel, who received an Oscar for performing the role of Mammy in Gone with the Wind. And the image of Mammy, I think, actually, in a contemporary context, becomes very interesting because how do we translate this Mammy figure, right? So some of the, what I would call one of the legacies of Mammy is the idea of the strong black woman. In Gone with the Wind, we saw, Scarlett would be crying on the shoulder of Mammy, right? And Scarlett, didn't know what to do and was kind of always flustered, but Mammy was the one that was able, she was strong, she was big, she was able to care for Scarlett in a way that a Mammy is expected to. So one of the legacies of Mammy that we see today is the image of the strong black woman. Now, what's important when we think about racial stereotypes is that an actual stereotype can be positive or negative, right, in terms of what the image actually is. So I know Tina's going to talk more about some of the Asian stereotypes in film, but when we think, for example, the stereotype of the model minority, right, that we hear a lot in terms of Asians, it's not necessarily a negative stereotype in the sense that, it's not an insult in the sense that you're being called intelligent or hardworking or that type of thing. That's not necessarily a negative thing, but the effects of the stereotypes are what we're interested in, and how those kind of get exploded into these huge stereotypes or caricatures of an image. So when you think about the strong black woman, it's not necessarily that it's a negative image per se, but when you think about it in the context of the legacy of Mammy, as I said earlier, or if you think about what that necessarily means for a black woman trying to experience or exert her subjectivity in a contemporary context, it becomes deeply problematic. Now, this semester, I was supposed to teach a class called Beyond Barack and Hillary, Black Feminist Culture, Literature, and Politics. And I'll be teaching in the fall instead. But as I've been thinking about some of these questions, I find that it intersects a lot with what I taught last semester and what I plan to teach in the fall. Again, because the image of the strong black woman, or the modern day Mammy, is an image that we saw a lot that we've seen a lot with our current First Lady, right? So this image of Michelle Obama as a strong woman is one that we've seen time and time again, right? In the very beginning, especially leading up to the actual nomination, Michelle Obama was seen as a castrating woman, right? Because she would say these things about her husband in public, saying that, oh, well, he's just a person, or he needs to pick up his socks, or he has bad breath in the morning. And these were comments that you saw circulating everywhere from the New York Times to, comics and jokes on Jay Leno. This was an image of Michelle Obama that people were, I would say that the image of Michelle Obama that we saw probably most often in the media was of this strong black woman. And she was also, what's also interesting about Michelle Obama is that as a darker skinned black woman, she would tend more to fill this role of Mammy as opposed to some of the other stereotypes of black women, like, for example, the tragic mulatto, who we also saw in D.W. Griffith's film. So when you think about, again, I'm bringing these things up because I think it's important to think about how do these stereotypes translate into a modern day context? What is the effect of these stereotypes in popular culture, in the media, in a contemporary setting? So what was interesting about the Michelle Obama stereotype, going back to what I was saying about a stereotype not necessarily being positive or negative, but looking at its effects, in this case, it worked in favor of Barack Obama because it allowed us to set up an opposition between Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, where if Michelle Obama is this castrating black woman, then Barack Obama cannot be the intimidating, dangerous black male that we saw in the film, right? He's not the typical black male rapist, that image, right? So to the detriment of the detriment of Michelle, this opposition could be set up, and it worked well for the figure of Barack Obama. He was portrayed as kind of effeminate. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger referred to him as, a girly man, that type of thing, saying, his legs are too skinny and whatnot. So there's a way in which the emasculation of Barack Obama actually was a way to undermine the traditional stereotype of black men, but worked, so although it worked against Michelle Obama, it worked in favor of her partner. Does everyone follow what I'm saying by that? Okay, good. So what's interesting is that, the idea of, again, a stereotype or a mammy or a superwoman as something that is seemingly innocuous, that it actually becomes very harmful and detrimental to black women, because it disallows them to really exercise, as I said, exercise their subjectivity in different ways. So another example of that is, again, one of the images we saw in the film is the stereotype of the black male rapist, right? So as Richard mentioned in my bio, I do a lot of work with sexual violence, and both as an advocate, as a performer, as an organizer. And so I tend to think, in these terms. But when you see those images of the black male rapist, that stereotype has an effect on black men, on white women, on black women, and on white men as well. What are one of the effects that we can see coming out of this image? I think that when you look at for example, when you look at the statistics of rape in the United States, the majority of rapes occur intra-racially. So white women are mostly raped by white men, black women are mostly raped by black men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what this image of the black male rapist does, actually, is not only is it to the detriment of black women who are not able to kind of claim their own narratives of rape, which is a kind of more complicated argument that I'll get into later. But one of the other things that it does is it silences white women's narratives of rape as well. Because if the assumption is that this white woman has been raped by a black man, then it disallows white women to really be able to express or to be able to express their own experiences with sexual violence when those are when they have been raped by white men, right? So today, how this manifests itself is a lot of times when survivors of sexual violence come out, they're chronically disbelieved, right? And so there's a way in which, and I think Michael does say this, he said this at the beginning of his presentation, but that these stereotypes are harmful to all the groups involved. It's not that it's just harmful to black women and to black men for the black male to be painted as a rapist, but it's also harmful to white women and white men as well. For black women, the way that this stereotypes functions, again, is that an image of black women that we didn't necessarily see here was the sexualized black women, right? So this image of black women as hypersexual. A lot of times what you saw during slavery, especially in the US, was that black women were also being raped by the plantation owners or by the slave owners. But because black women were viewed as property, it wasn't really considered rape, right? Because it's your own property that you're sexually abusing. So black women are not, they're not considered as human. They're considered as property. So it wasn't necessarily against the law. So what happens with that is that we see this image that starts to circulate is the image of the hyper-sexual, promiscuous black woman, right? So this is functioning, again, in parallel to the hypersexual black men. So, black men are hypersexual, black women are hypersexual. They're all just hypersexual. And unfortunately, what would happen with that in black women is that their stories of, again, their narratives of rape were immediately silenced, right? Because if they can't be raped. There's this image of black women that they could never be raped. And then today, if we take that all the way through, you can go look at a music video and you'll see an image of a hypersexualized black woman. Another very prominent example of a hypersexualized black woman was Saartjie Baartman, the Venus Hottentot. How many people have heard of the Venus Hottentot? The Venus Hottentot her name was Sarah Baartman, and she was a black woman, a South African woman, who was actually taken and put on display throughout Europe, mostly in France, for the enormous size of her buttocks. And so the enormous size of her rear end was something to behold, and she was placed on display, and eventually her genitals were also put on display in the Musée de l'Homme, a large museum in France. And so this image, again, is one of a deviant, a stranger black woman, right? And unfortunately, when you look today at some of the media images of black women, the same images, it looks almost identical to some of these clips of Saartjie Baartman. Unfortunately, I don't have any clips. So a lot of the stuff that I'm saying would be great to have clips. Now, how do contemporary Black artists in the diaspora respond to these images? What do they do with them today? The Venus Hottentot serves as a good example because a few Black women, namely Susan Laurie Parks, wrote a play called Venus. She's an amazing playwright and performer. If you ever have a chance to see anything by her, you should go. So she writes a play called Venus in which she treats the subject of the Venus Hottentot, but all from her own perspective. And also what she does is she brings forward the story of the Venus Hottentot for a larger public. It's something that, a lot of people haven't heard of. And so she kind of popularizes this image to raise awareness about what actually happened to this woman. Another artist who wrote about the Venus Hottentot is Elizabeth Alexander, who was actually the poet that was chosen she was the inaugural poet this year. So, there are ways, these stereotypes are there, but I think that you can find a lot of Black artists are taking these stereotypes and really trying to explode them and trying to question them and trying to dismantle them. Another example that came to mind, and you can't help for it to come to mind when you look at these scenes from Birth of a Nation, is Spike Lee's film Bamboozled. And Spike Lee's film, has anyone seen that movie? Yeah. Spike Lee's film Bamboozled, in which, again, he takes on these stereotypes in a number of ways, right? And he shows, he unveils some of the ways that film in the U.S. has not progressed. He shows us that some of these images that were still bamboozled, that some of the stereotypical images of Sambo, for example, have a modern day equivalent in some actors, for example, in some of the more kind of slapstick comedic actors. He looks at examples from, everything from Cuba Gooding Jr. in, now the name of the film is escaping me. With Tom Cruise? Jerry Maguire, yes, thank you. With Jerry Maguire, but also, even examples from In Living Color or Chris, now all these people are escaping me. Chris Tucker, exactly, Chris Tucker. A lot of these movies today, a lot of the contemporary Black actors, according to Spike Lee, are bamboozled in the same way. They employ some of the same stereotypes that we saw in the film. And I think that in terms of that, though, we need to be careful for Spike Lee, because Spike Lee is also someone who has himself used a lot. His portrayal of Black women has consistently been very deeply problematic. And consistently, we have seen hyper-sexualized Black women in his films. I'm thinking of the most recent film he had, Miracle at Santa Ana, where the only Black woman in the film is a woman who, in the very first scene, is half naked, imploring an Italian man, to have sex with her. They're in a bedroom kind of context. Now, this woman never shows up anywhere else in the film. It really has no relevance in the storyline at all. It's just, I don't know why, I guess just to show the image of a sexualized Black woman. So Spike Lee is a good example of someone that really typifies this still strange fruit behavior that I'm talking about, because on the one hand, he wants to challenge the stereotypes of Black people in film, and he does a good job with a film like Bamboozled, unveiling the deeply problematic images of Black people that have circulated since this film. But at the same time, when it comes to understanding intersectionality or deconstructing how gender operates in these stereotypes, he falls really short. So some of the other things that I want us to think about are, how does this notion of strangeness affect how we think about race, right? And again, going back to our current president, I think that this is something that we saw a lot in terms of how he's framed and how he's talked about. He's always portrayed as someone who's very intelligent, who's very quote unquote articulate, someone who's charismatic, and a lot of the narrative surrounding him was one in which people, this was a strange thing, that he wasn't considered a typical African American. That not only that, he also had an African father. So again, this narrative of strangeness, I think, was employed multiple times, both positively and negatively, throughout the course of the campaign. And I mean, less now in terms of the presidency. I guess people have other things they want to talk about him for, but definitely in terms of how he was constructed in the media as an image. Let's see. So what I've done basically is really, given you some comments about how, comments from popular culture, comments from the media, about how these stereotypes are functioning in a larger frame. And I think that as I always encourage my students, in the fall I taught a class called Narratives of Violence in Africa and the Diaspora. And I would always tell my students that I want them to be readers of the world, that when we discuss something in class, I want them to go out and think about how these questions operate in a larger context. So we would talk about the representation of violence in class, but I would also hope that when they were reading the newspaper or when they would see any violent image that they would see anywhere, they would think about some of these questions as well. And so that's what I'm kind of hoping to do here is push you to consider how these stereotypes that we saw from these clips, how they translate into a modern day context. How do they translate for the images that we see every day? What does it mean for us when we watch D.L. Hughley's new show on CNN, in which he's commenting about the news? What does that mean for racial stereotypes? What does it mean when we see these images of Michelle Obama, like the one that we saw in the New Yorker with her holding a gun and with an afro? What does that say about about stereotypes? And what is the legacy of some of these stereotypes as well? What does it say when you watch a music video? How are those images? How are some of those images still in circulation? But also, how are some of them still not in circulation as well? How have we progressed also from that? And also, in terms of the image of the African, I think that's a whole another set of comments. But I think that image in particular, we need to think about, when we think about strangeness, we have to, again, think in terms of intersectionality and how these things are layered, right? So if you take a film like Coming to America, for example, which was a film that Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall starred in, and it was the story of this African man, or an African prince, quote unquote, who comes to the U.S. and basically finds an African American wife. But the image of Africa in that film is, again, very deeply problematic. It employs a lot of stereotypes. And I think that even when you look at something that's from the African American perspective, that you also have to consider what is normative in that context and what is strange in that context. So that's a good example of a film in which you see the image of the African as something that is exotic, as something that is strange, as something that is only given according to a number of stereotypes, but that's an African American film. So again, what are the different ways in which we can think globally about these questions as well? Someone that does this really well is another African writer. Her name is Calixte Beala. And she wrote a book called Femme Noire, Black Woman. And in this book, she presents it's almost like a narrative of a Black woman's sexual desire. And this Black woman with a huge sexual appetite, extremely hypersexual. And she, again, takes these stereotypes and literally explodes them and puts them right in your face. So what does a book like that do for our image of stereotypes of Black women? Does that challenge them? Does it support them? And interestingly, Calixte Beala, the very title of her novel, she took that from a poem by Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was one of the great writers of a literary movement, a Francophone literary movement called Negritude, and he was actually one of the first presidents of Senegal. He wrote a poem called Femme Noire, Femme Nue, in which it's supposed to be, it's in praise of the Black woman. But in that praise of the Black woman, he also uses a lot of stereotypes. He looks at the Black woman as maternal. He looks at the Black woman as someone to be desired, a sexual object. He looks at the Black woman as literally embodying the African continent. So that's another example that came to mind to me, as well as I thought about how contemporary artists are engaging these stereotypes. Because there you have, again, you have intersectionality right there with Calixte Beala taking this very gendered stereotype that Sebed had and writing an entire novel based on it. So I think that I will stop there. I don't know how much I can talk
Yeah,
about.
that's fine.
Um,
You have about 5 minutes.
A book, okay, a book that I would point you to on stereotypes of African Americans in film in particular is Donald Bogle's Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, An Interpretive History of Blacks in American Film. And I love this book because the title says it all. These are the images of African Americans that we see in film and that I would argue that we still see today. They're the Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the questions period.
Thank you, Richard, very much for inviting me to be a guest in the seminar. I actually want to start by saying that the whole concept of the stereotype is not really one that I use in my own scholarship at all, and I actually find it fairly limiting as a critical tool and not necessarily conducive to nuanced or complex analysis. I often find that it gets used to kind of put an end to analysis rather than to open it up in ways that move it forward. I find that to say that something is a stereotype, to say that it's in particularly a racial stereotype, often implies that that's all it is and that's all we need to know about a particular text or a narrative or whatever it is, and we can just stop there because we've found the answer. And I've noticed this recently in debate just in surrounding the film Slumdog Millionaire, which is of course very popular. But a common critique of the film is, oh, well, it's just another Western stereotypical portrait of India as poor and backward, sort of poverty porn, if you want. But I also find that once someone has made that critique, that's sort of the end of the discussion. There's really nothing left to say, when in fact there's obviously an element of truth in that charge, but there's many, many other interesting things to say about the film. The way that it merges conventions of Hollywood and Bollywood, or the way it thinks about modernization and upward mobility, or the way that the effects that it will undoubtedly have on the Indian film industry as it tries to make crossover films for Western audiences. There's all ways in which that film is very, very interesting. But once you sort of bring out that accusation of it's just a stereotype, it sort of shuts down other possibilities for conversations. So that's just to say that this is, in fact, not a sort of a concept that I'm using very much in that way in my own work. On the other hand, I do teach a class on Asian American cinema, and of course this topic of stereotypes comes up quite a bit. It's impossible to avoid a discussion of stereotypes when you're looking at representations of Asians and Asian Americans in Hollywood film, which is sort of part of the conversation about Asian American cinema, and also when you're looking at the type of concepts and ideas that Asian American filmmakers are grappling with. Of course, stereotypes comes up a lot in that as well. And I do think it's an important topic for undergraduates to engage with. I'm always surprised at how many students are not familiar with the full range of stereotypes, media stereotypes about Asian Americans, and how they often say that this is one of the few classes in which they do talk about that stuff. So it's not to say it doesn't have value. It is important, and especially for undergraduates. But this is all a preface of saying that the comments that I'm going to make do come out of my undergraduate class in a lot of ways, and are perhaps not as sophisticated as what you guys have been doing in the rest of the seminar. I'm not exactly sure the sorts of conversations you've been having. But what I want to do is just give an overview of some of the most common stereotypes of Asians and Asian Americans, to just give a sort of a review of it. And I should just make clear at this point that I'm talking about mostly East Asian images rather than South Asian or Southeast Asian or anything that, so it's restricted in that way.
Before
yeah?
we go on, can I just make one remark? I omitted to mention it at the beginning, but as the class knows, and I think you've seen it too, Anjan Lee did a short video collage of certain scenes from Asian American cinema and Asian cinema. And we can presuppose that in our discussion.
Okay, that's fine.
So
And
it was circulated too.
beforehand. Okay, that's good, and I've got some clips too. But some of the ways that I think that we can think about these images, these stereotypes, one of the ways that's interesting is the tension between the historicity and the ahistoricity, as it were, of these images. The ways in which these images are produced and take on certain meanings in specific historical moments and specific historical situations. And on the other hand, the ways in which they persist over time, they never really go away. They're always available to be recycled and reused and regenerated and resurrected as a new situation requires them. The relationship between the national and international dimensions of these images and the interplay between them. Some of them develop around Asians in Asia, some of them develop around Asians in America, and there's some overlap between them, but they're not necessarily exactly the same. The relationship between race and gender in these images, how certain stereotypes develop around Asian and Asian American men, others develop around women. Certain ones can be applied to both, certain ones are more exclusive. And then finally, the tensions between specificity and generality in these images, how some of these stereotypes have been associated primarily with Asians and Asian Americans, and others have been applied with some variation to a variety of people who get classified as other, and so they're not necessarily specific to Asians. So one of the things that's interesting about stereotypes is their historical specificity, and I should hang on to one of those actually for myself if it comes back. Is their historical specificity combined with their mutability and fluidity, which is to say their capacity to change over time as social, political, economic, and military conditions change. In 1958, journalist Harold Isaac, thank you very much, published a study called Scratches on Our Minds, American Images of China and India, in which he sought to discover what is it exactly that Americans know or think they know about China and India. And the book is a kind of a catalog of stereotypes held by Americans at different historical moments. And he breaks down the American attitudes towards China into different ages, right? Different historical periods have different kinds of stereotypes associated with them. And for example, he calls the period from 1905 to 1937 the Age of Benevolence. And this is a period in China when Chinese reformers and radicals are undertaking the process of political and social modernization. They're embracing certain aspects of westernization. It's also the period when Japan is encroaching on China and will eventually launch a full-fledged attack in the 30s that will turn into World War II in the Pacific Theater. And so it's during this time, Isaac says, that Americans come to see themselves as guardians of an infantilized China. The relationship between China and the U.S. is often represented in hierarchical and familial terms, with China as a child that needs help, and America as the parent that is helping and encouraging it to grow into a modern, democratic, capitalist nation. And this image of China as an infant that needs American help really becomes widespread in the 1930s. So on one side here, I'm sorry, obviously the quality of the image is not very great. This image here is of a child from 1937, a baby in the streets of Shanghai after the Japanese bombing of that city. And this was a photo that was widely circulated, wisely used to raise funds for China relief to help the Chinese defend themselves. And it obviously works by encouraging a kind of sense of parental feeling, a sense of parental obligation. We have to go and help this poor child. This poor child needs our help. So that child becomes a kind of stand-in in that sense for China. And of course, after the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Revolution of 1949, the political relationship between the U.S. and China changes dramatically, and the stereotypical image of Chinese people changes as well. Americans enter into what Isaacs called the age of hostility. And if you look at that other image there on that page, it says figure 12, men without women, women without men, children without parents. This was published in Newsweek in 1958. And suddenly that familial discourse, that familial system of representation breaks down. Chinese people are represented in the media as severing familial ties among themselves as they're each segregated into their own sort of sex-defined social roles, and presented as destroying the individual, becoming a mass of indistinguishable and interchangeable robots who are barely human at all. Communist Chinese in their Mao suits are often described in the American media as blue-suited ants, a kind of vision of a terrifying mass entity that has neither individual identity nor a kind of family subunits. And after China's successful assault against U.S. forces in the Korean War, this image becomes stronger and more prominent. There's lots of talk of the human wave that just keeps on coming. The mass of soldiers is so vast that individual deaths don't matter. This kind of thing. But so what we see in the juxtaposition of these two images, I think, is the flexibility of these images, how quickly they can change as a larger sort of material, political, economic relationship changes, but that it can sometimes be working within a same kind of discursive register, that one kind of family relationship, when you want to present that this sort of positive image in a relationship of obligation, but then another kind of image in which you depict the severing of familial ties as a kind of stereotype that comes to embody a different set of material and political economic relations. In War Without Mercy, his book, a book by historian John Dower, documents a similar kind of flexibility in the stereotypes of the Japanese generated by Americans during and immediately after World War II. And Dower shows how the Japanese people as a whole were uniformly racialized in American propaganda in a way that the Germans were not. A characteristic feature of this level of anti-Japanese sentiment, he writes, was the resort to non-human or subhuman representation in which the Japanese were perceived as animals, reptiles or insects, monkeys, baboons, gorillas, dogs, mice and rats, vipers and rattlesnakes, cockroaches, vermin, or more indirectly, the Japanese herd and the like. And that's a quote from Dower. Dower argues that this dehumanization, which he documents on the Japanese propaganda side as well as the American, had very real consequences in the waging of the war and helped make the Pacific theater of the war much more brutal than was the European side of the conflict, and aided in the development of this of an exterminationist sentiment among the U.S. military. And he talks about how the most common image of the Japanese in U.S. propaganda was as apes or monkeys, yet the meanings that were applied to that particular kind of image were fluid, and that's just on the flip side of this, of the piece of paper, that during the war, the ape became a preferred way to represent the Japanese as supermen after the shocking and wholly unexpected military successes at Pearl Harbor and Singapore. This huge lumbering ape was a way to present the Japanese as particularly powerful and particularly brutal in that use of power. But then the image right next to it, after the defeat of Japan, this image changes very quickly. That Superman ape becomes a kind of domesticated and easily controlled a pet monkey. So again, operating within the same general visual and discursive framework, but the meanings have great fluidity and can change very quickly. And I think that these two pairs of images point to the tensions between the historicity and the ahistoricity of stereotypes, and also to the tension between their specificity and their generality. All four of these images are very clearly rooted in specific historical moments and very specific encounters between Americans and Chinese and Japanese. And yet at the same time, these images clearly have a long history that predates these specific historical moments. There's a long history, of course, of categorizing certain categories of people as children, as indistinguishable a mass, as monkeys. These are all kind of a familiar set of representations. And Dower addresses the simultaneous historical specificity and generality of these images when he writes, "The war did not create the image of the Japanese Superman, but rather brought it to the surface, conjured it up not from some pool of past impressions of the Japanese, but rather from the great Western reservoir of traditional images of the other. For like the mark of the beast and the numerous traits of the lesser men, in times of fear and crisis, superhuman qualities are too commonly ascribed to despised outsiders. Special powers assigned to avowedly lesser men and women take many forms, including physical prowess, sexual appetite, intuitive genius, occult skills, fanaticism, a special capacity for violence, monopolization of certain forms of knowledge or control, and even an alleged capacity for evil." And that's end quote. I think this captures nicely the kind of duality we often see in stereotypes of Asians. On the one hand, despised for an alleged inferiority, and the other hand, feared for their alleged special powers of one sort or another, and that there's a lot of toggling between these two poles in close proximity to each other. Dower also urges us to see the continuities in the racial stereotypes that populate American history and American consciousness, to see how images of the Chinese and Japanese from the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s are part of a much longer history of racial discourses stretching back to Indian wars, settlement of the continent, slavery, conquest of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and the larger history of Western imperialism more generally, that they belong to this much longer history. And similarly, how the stereotypes generated around World War II, the 30s and the 40s, get recycled and reused in future conflicts in Asia and the rest of the world, that they stick around and can be remobilized in new situations. I want to turn to the question of stereotypes in popular film and look at a few clips. I know that you saw those series of clips that Jen put together. Lots of film and media scholars have written on this topic, and there's a number of documentary films that have collected and explored these images. Two of the most well-known are Slaying the Dragon from 1988, which focuses on stereotypes of Asian and Asian American women, and The Slanted Screen, which came out in 2006, which focuses on Asian American men, and which is, I think, where most of the clips that you saw came from that film. In his book Asian America Through the Lens, film scholar Jun Xing categorizes the variety of stereotypes and groups them under three general headings. And every scholar sort of categorizes them, lumps them together in different ways, but this, I think, is a fairly good one. And he talks about the Yellow Peril, Charlie Chan, and Madame Butterfly / Susie Wong as categories. And I just want to walk through these categories and look at a couple examples. I don't have examples from everything, but look at some of these examples. Jun Xing's first category is Yellow Peril, and this body of stereotype expresses Western fears of Asians as a collective mass threat. And there's a long history, of course, to this fear, from European fear of Genghis Khan through the perceived fear of Japan as a rising imperial power in the early 20th century, anxiety over the economic threat posed by Asian immigrants in the early 20th century, fears of communist China at mid-century, fears of Japanese competition and anxiety in the 1980s, and I think anxiety about China as an economic competitor today. These are all fears, I think, of the West of being overrun or being contaminated or being dominated by Asians. And Xing breaks the Yellow Peril down into two subcategories. One is the Yellow Peril as sexual threat towards white women and white racial purity, the figure of the Oriental rapist. And this comes up most often in early films and silent Hollywood films like Cecil B. DeMille's The Cheat, in which the Japanese-born star actor Sessue Hayakawa plays a man who lusts after a white woman, but he doesn't quite rape her, but he brands her with a hot poker, and then he's subsequently lynch-mobbed in a courtroom. And I'm sorry I don't have a clip of that, because that's fairly dramatic. And the second subcategory is Yellow Peril as a military threat. And this is, I think, a much more common and has remained much more continuously in circulation. And I want to show the first clip, which is of Ming the Merciless and Fu Manchu, which are these, terms for characters. So both of these figures, Ming the Merciless and Fu Manchu, they're treacherous, they're cunning, they're bent on world domination. The Yellow Peril as a threat to white political and military superiority.
Flash Gordon in his attempt to rule the universe.
Let's get going. Make me attack us before we've accomplished our mission.
Unless you release me at once, Father, Flash Gordon and Dr. Zarkov will return here and pull you from your throne as they did once before.
As they did once before. Yet I still survive, still rule the universe, while they...
Yes, Father.
Are at this moment headed for certain destruction and a trap that I have prepared for them. The audience is at an end, Your Highness.
Mad scientist Fu Manchu was the incarnation of evil. In his crusade to conquer the world, he was assisted by his cunning daughter, played by Anna May Wong. She immortalized the diabolical Dragon Lady, an image that still lives today.
So that this idea of the sort of the yellow peril as threatening and bent on world domination gets extended through all kinds of other films. These are obviously sort of fantasy and science fiction type genres, but obviously in the war film, the World War II film, Korean film, Vietnam War film keeps coming back, but also in gangster films where you have a kind of collective Asian presence within the country. And where the yellow peril is associated with immigrants, and in thrillers such as Rising Sun from 1993, where Japan is perceived as an economic threat, invokes that older yellow peril imagery. And this is a stereotype that it's most often gendered in masculine terms as a masculine threat, also has a feminine version, just that brief image that we saw of the dragon lady, inscrutable, unknowable, mysterious, eroticized but menacing. Her sexuality and mysterious erotic powers are very much a threat to the sort of legitimacy or power of white men and white women. And I think in a lot of this, you can see so many resonances, I think, with just what we were talking about as stereotypes of African Americans, that this is a place where you can sort of see some of those. But this is also a place where I think it's possible to see the analytical limitations that come with focusing too narrowly on stereotypes. Both Anna May Wong, who's the actress the sort of in this instance of the Dragon Lady, and Sesue Hayakawa were big stars in Hollywood. They were popular, they made a lot of money, they had sort of solid careers for a long time. And both of them are subjects of recent biographies and cultural histories that try to get beyond that stereotypes just of those roles and images that appear on screen, and try to get at a more complex pictures of lives and careers and how they negotiated the Hollywood system, how they negotiated American racial attitudes, how they negotiated relations between the U.S. and Asia. And by looking beyond the nature of... hold on. Sorry, this is totally mixed up, my pages. By thinking about the sort of the lives that extend beyond just those images on screen, I think that you can get a richer analysis and a more complex picture than just looking at the sort of, okay, here's this image, here's this image, here's this stereotypical image. You get a kind of catalog that ends up, I think, sometimes with a kind of a flatness to it, but a more cultural historian's approach or an American studies approach shows that that's not all that's necessarily going on there. The yellow peril is most often figured as an external threat to the nation, but that association of Asians with foreignness, with alienness, with absolute difference has, of course, attached itself to Asian Americans as well. And this aspect of the stereotype has its roots in U.S. immigration laws that, beginning in the mid-19th century, gradually restricted the entries of Chinese people and Korean people and Japanese and other Asians into the U.S. before that immigration was cut off entirely in 1924. And at the same time, U.S. laws classifying Asian immigrants as aliens ineligible for citizenship and restricting Asians from becoming naturalized citizenship, the only Asians being the only immigrant group that were so categorized in racial grounds as being not allowed to become naturalized citizens. So that immigration and naturalization laws establish this idea and make it concrete in law about Asians as permanently foreign, permanently unassimilable, permanently other from other Americans. And to the point that even after these laws are rescinded in stages in 1952 and 1965 immigration acts, that association of foreignness still very much clings to Asian Americans born here, have family here for generations. That carries over. The second category of stereotypes that Xing talks about is the figure of Charlie Chan, and this gets into the question of sort of positive and negative stereotypes, and that sort of doesn't necessarily matter. We think more about the effects of how they work. But the Charlie Chan stereotype gets applied primarily to Asian Americans rather than to Asians. Charlie Chan is, of course, the Hawaii police detective made famous through dozens of novels and TV shows, starting in the and movies starting in the 20s and 30s. And I think in the clip that you saw that circulated, there was a Charlie Chan clip from The Jade Mask. And Charlie Chan is the polar opposite of the yellow peril in a set of associations: the good Oriental, submissive to white authorities, loyal to America, willing to use his cleverness to maintain social order, but still inscrutable and mysterious. But now that he's the possessor of sort of an ancient Oriental wisdom rather than some kind of dangerous Oriental power based on world domination or aspiring to that. But perhaps most importantly, Charlie Chan is kind of asexual and is kind of feminized. That part of his rendering him not a threat is to neuter him in certain sorts of ways in his presentation. There's lots of variations on the Charlie Chan figure. The figure of the houseboy, Hop Sing, the cook and laundry boy from 19th century Western American fiction, and from the TV show Bonanza. And you can see a variation of this in the clip from 16 Candles that is on the clip tape that you all saw. That teen boy who is so helpful around the house. He does the wash, he does the laundry, he cleans up. And an explicit figure of mockery for his effeminacy and his subservience. And I think it's worth bringing in Bruce Lee here. The clips that you looked at had a clip from the Green Hornet TV show. Bruce Lee is in a face mask. But I think you have to read Lee as a reaction against the Charlie Chan body of stereotypes. He's incredibly physical, skilled with his body, incredibly masculine, skilled in the arts of violence. He expresses a lot of racial pride, cultural pride, national pride in being Chinese. And of course, he's wildly popular across the ethno-racial map in the US and frankly around the world. He's really the first Asian global celebrity. And he's a very empowering figure for all kinds of kids, young boys, especially Black and Latino boys, but really, who doesn't love Bruce Lee in the end? But what happens to Bruce Lee is that he becomes solidified into yet another kind of a stereotype, into another kind of an image. All Asians know martial arts, right? A variation on that yellow peril idea that Asians are possessors of some secret kind of Oriental knowledge. Another variation on that Charlie Chan figure is the model minority, which we heard just a little bit about. And this is the stereotype that has the most currency today. I think that students recognize it, deal with it, feel that they encounter it and run into it most often. And this is one that's pretty specific to Asian Americans rather than Asians. The idea that Asian Americans are quiet, smart, law-abiding, don't cause trouble, they're hardworking, they're good at schools, they have strong families, they're economically successful, all that set of sort of positive associations. But one of the interesting things about the model minority stereotype is that it works as a racial triangle rather than a more simple racial binary opposition. It imagines the relationship between the Asians and whites and blacks rather than just between Asians and whites. This particular version of the Charlie Chan figure, the model minority, gets articulated in a specific historical moment, the late 1960s, the context of the Black Civil Rights Movement, when journalists begin contrasting the good Asian minorities to the bad Black minorities, and Asians are presented as the model minorities, Asian Americans, because they don't make the demands on the state for redress for discrimination. They improve themselves economically without state assistance. They don't complain about racism. They don't go on welfare. They don't riot. They don't have babies out of wedlock. They don't have all these pathologies that are associated with African Americans. And as such, that model minority stereotype does important ideological work, rebutting Black assertions that America is inherently racist by showing that some racial minorities are doing well, and thus makes Black Americans and not the state or not white Americans responsible for whatever social problems they're suffering. That if you have social problems, well, obviously it's your own fault because look at these good minorities over here, they're doing fine. So that model minority stereotype really functions as a blunt instrument for delegitimizing and undermining Black political demands, social demands, economic demands. And as much as the model minority comes into prominence in the sort of the mid and late 1960s, a number of scholars, including Bob Lee in his book Orientals, have argued that the roots can be traced back further to the 1950s and to a different political context of the Cold War. So that thinking about here's a stereotype that has very much a national kind of domestic set of meanings, but also has a kind of an international set of meanings and roots as well. That the relevant history isn't so much the civil rights movement, but the decolonization movement in Asia and Africa. As U.S. empires were crumbling and new nations were being created in Asia and Africa, Washington was very concerned with winning these new nations over to its side in the Cold War. Come be with us, don't be with us Soviet Union. And American race relations proved a big stumbling block to this political process, that newly independent Asian and African peoples would look at the unequal treatment of African Americans within the U.S., and they would take that as proof that the U.S. had imperial aspirations abroad, and that it would simply seek to replace the European imperial powers with an equally racist, although less direct, American domination. But there was a lot of talk about American racism as the Achilles heel of U.S. foreign policy in the late 50s and early 60s in dealing with the decolonizing world. As a way to rebut these politically damaging accusations of racism and imperialism, the Washington and liberal elites went out of their way to condemn racism and to deny that Americans were inherently racist. And the Cold War 1950s are really awash in professions of racial liberalism, racial tolerance, inclusions, condemnations of prejudice. Not being alive at the time, you go back and you look at this stuff and it's sort of amazing. You don't think that this would be so much in the mainstream in the 1950s. And in the popular discourses of the late 50s and early 60s, Asian Americans become figures for successful assimilation, successful Americanization. These are the racial minorities who are succeeding in America, and as such, they offer proof not just to sort of African Americans, Black Americans as the way to do things, but proof to the decolonizing world, to people in Asia, to people in Africa, that the U.S. was not a racist and imperialist nation, so that their ideological function is oriented towards an international arena as well as towards just a domestic national one. And we can see these successfully assimilated Asian Americans in all kinds of popular discourses in the late 1950s. Popular discourses about Hawaii, multiracial, multi-Asian ethnic Hawaii as a paragon of racial harmony. In the popular embrace of the figure of the Asian war bride married to the white serviceman and the Asian child adopted by white parents, this idea of American families as multiracial, and in popular novels and movies such as Flower Drum Song. Flower Drum Song was the first Broadway musical in 1958 and the first Hollywood film in 1961 to have an almost entirely Asian and Asian American cast. It was based on a popular novel by Chinese-American writer C.Y. Lee, and it focused on a Chinese-American family in San Francisco that is assimilated into the American mainstream. And here, Chinese and American are categories that easily harmonize with each other. They're no longer mutually exclusive categories, and we no longer have these kind of yellow peril ideas of foreignness and alienness. And instead, this assimilated Chinese-American family becomes proof of America's racial tolerance and racial inclusiveness. And I just have a clip from...
You are like the Chinese dish the Americans invented. What do they call it? Chop suey. That is it. Everything is in it, all mixed up.
I like that. Chop suey, chop suey.
In Flower Drum Song, the setting is San Francisco's Chinatown, and the theme is assimilation of Chinese in America. Since the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 and the enactment of other more lenient immigration laws, Chinatowns have become thriving communities in the 1960s.
So I just wanted you to see a little bit about what that looks like. And a lot of scholars read this as an early incarnation of what will solidify into the model minority stereotype. But again, here, I think a narrow focus on stereotypes can limit our understanding of the complexities of the text, the different ways in which it was read, and I think always the reading and reception is important to think about when we're talking about these kinds of things. Playwright David Henry Hwang, who redid Flower Drum Song for Broadway a couple years back, has written about how important the movie was to him and other young Asian Americans at the time, that they were incredibly excited to see these characters on screen, to see Asian American youth as assimilated, as playing baseball, as going out on dates, as driving cars, as having regular old romantic problems, and so that it only later becomes this kind of these are a bad set of images. And so I think it lets us think about the sort of the complex social and cultural role that these images play in a way that a sort of a simple and flattened out understanding of a stereotype allows for. And then the final category that of sort of Madame Butterfly and Susie Wong stereotypes, highly gendered stereotype, one that applies to Asian and Asian Americans, highly eroticized, highly sexualized, available to white men, often as spoils of war. And I don't know if we're running out of time, maybe won't show the clips for that, but I think it resonates, in interesting ways with what Regine was talking about. Some of these are images from Japan, of sort of post-conquest Japan, American servicemen in Japan falling in love with Japanese women, being catered to by Japanese women, and part of that redefinition of Japan after the war, when Japan is a defeated enemy, it becomes highly gendered and much more pleasing to that white man. And Gina Marchetti has written a whole book about these Asian white romances, looking at the kind of ideological contradictions that are going on. There's many of them in Hollywood films. Racial liberalism on one hand, a kind of conservative gender ideologies on the other, and how did that, in those gaps and contradictions, often serving these films as a kind of a metaphoric justification for white male dominance over both women and Asians. And what I wanted to show, but I don't think we have enough time, is to sort of think a little bit about the ways in which Asian American filmmakers have to grapple with these issues and deal with them in their own works, and engage with them. And what I did have was a clip from Margaret Cho's "I'm the One That I Want," which is funny. I don't know. Can we show it? So let's show that, and you can see it's funny. So it's always good to end with something funny, but to think about how. This sort of how she presents herself. She's a stand-up comedian. This is part of her concert film, a kind of routine. The film is about, she talks about her experience in a failed TV show called All American Girl, and how she was under intense pressure to conform to certain Hollywood stereotypes of what an Asian American woman should be, what she should look like. It was incredibly destructive psychologically and physically. She ends up in the hospital. And so this sort of concert show is her talking about making comedy about her experience of that and her recovery from that. And the clip that I want to show, which will take a little minute for the DVD to kind of cue up, is sort of how she ends the film, her final little bit of the routine. But I think it implies a whole way of engaging with a lot of these stereotypes and turning them into sort of comedy, and without just simply sort of saying, oh, they're meaningless, we're done with them, but you still kind of grappling with them.
And they say that certain smells bring you back to childhood. Like my friend says, when she smells wood burning in the air, she's reminded of Christmas in Maine when she was 5 years old. And the smell that takes me back is balls in pantyhose.
She spent a lot of time talking about how she's a fag hag and her relationship with gay men.
When I smell that, tears come to my eyes. When I smell poppers, I wet my pants. But I grew up here on Polk Street in the 70s.
In San Francisco.
Which was the gayest place in the world. And my parents owned a bookstore there. And my mother was in charge of the gay porn. So every day she would unpack boxes of gay porn and try to talk to me about it. This book, this color es besto. This book for gay. Because gay, they like ass. They like ass so much they don't know what to do. I think they like ass too much. I want to say you have to have ass in the moderation. You cannot have ass all the time. If you have ass all the time, then it's not special. I know a gay. His name is Paul. And Paul is so nice. But Paul only like two things. He like ass and Judy Garland. And that's all. What kind of life is it? Es Western. Mommy gonna look at Ace Master now. I have to look at it. I'm so curious. I'm so curious about Ace. Ace Master.
She's obviously reworking through a lot of things. She's loud, she's not quiet, she's aggressive, not passive. She's highly sort of sexual in certain ways, but she's very crude and vulgar. She's not exotic. She's rejecting the whole set of model minorities associations. She offers an alternative model of assimilation. What you assimilate into, this vision of a San Francisco family, not what you see in Flower Drum Song. So she's playing with a lot of these things, and this idea of foreignness, doing this routine of her mother with an accent, still somehow foreign, but also sort of American in her engagement with porn, not necessarily what you think of as the assimilated Korean mom or half assimilated. So she's really playing with all these things in a way that I think is funny and I think fairly complex. And so I'll close that, and I'm sorry about the